Yes, so the task for me was to look a bit about what are institutional settings that are needed regarding the coordination mechanisms. And what I would like to start with is, a bit asking the question, why is coordination relevant? And coming from the economic research area, we economists, we know as a justification of coordination across actors or countries is first a reason if there is a public good concerned or if there are external spillovers which cannot be considered by an individual actors appropriately, then there's a need for coordination. Another need for coordination is if there's insufficient information or asymmetric information, and then economic decisions are based on this insufficient information. A next reason can be that risks becoming too high for the individual compensation. And this is specifically the case for maybe what Jesus means with catastrophic risks that are very infrequent, but with very high damages. So there it's welfare increasing if you have a coordination or a coordinative approach. And then it's especially relevant for let's say for a regulatory space like the EU to have a coordination across different policies and different political actors, because there can be silo approaches and contradictions. And now for the food policy, the following questions are these situations and reasons relevant for food security and food crisis? And second, what are really resulting criteria for operationalizing coordination? And to give maybe two ideas of answers, food security and crisis reaction can be, at least partially, be seen as a public good. That does not mean that the public actor, the state, needs to offer everything of this public good, but maybe the framework, the political framework, to interconnect with private actors as well. And we have some from the series, some general principles. I mentioned that already in the debate, which is called, for instance, one is the principle of fiscal equivalence. And that goes back to the 60s. Olson and Musgrave are representatives of this idea. And this said that the regulatory level for management or for deciding on this public good should be equal to the spatial scope of affected actors. So a global public good should be decided at the global regulatory level. Plus, additionally, this should be equal to that level that is having the financial burden or that has to finance these public goods. And the second answer to this question is specifically thinking about a broad policy mix. Food security and crisis reaction, we have seen that already, for instance, with Catherine's examples, by a very broad set of very different policy mixes. And there's one famous economic criteria how to organize that, which is the Tinbergen rule. It's a Nobel Prize person saying that one measure, one target. So not to overburden measures, trying to address very, very different targets with one and the same measure. Another very important, more political principle is known from the political sciences or the philosophy of sciences, and this is the idea of coherence. And it's a kind of buzzword. We use that very often. A policy should be coherent. But what does it exactly mean, and how could one define that politically? And I summarized very briefly, are there existing really and relevant political guidelines how to establish coordination? And we heard about some of them already. There is actually, one must say, there's a larger call for coordination than there exist concrete guidelines for that. But there are some. The starting point historically comes from the disaster risk reduction or humanitarian assistance arena. We heard already about the UN Sendai framework. There's as well, there are some guidelines or recommendations on policy coherence, which is focused on sustainable development, for instance, the OECD recommendations. So we have some, but not large guideline approaches. What we find more is sectoral guidelines and criteria of how to organize cooperation. And one level is at the global level. For instance, on trade, we have some quite concrete criteria how to organize trade if we think, and trade experts often do so, trade as a kind of public good. For instance, the WTO has golden rules, which is first reciprocity and then non-discrimination of countries. That means to offer the same open market access to everybody. And then there's another criteria more from the standard organizations. I think we heard that already as an example today, the Codex Alimentarius, which is on food safety and not on food security. And there the idea is to build upon a common sense, a scientific-based sense on what are necessary standards to achieve. And there the basic is a scientific basis. And this is then linked to WTO rules in the sense that this kind of standards can be enforced by trade measures. So there are quite concrete criteria what coordination in a trade sense can mean. We have other concrete criteria at the regional level, and we heard about some of these examples as well already. One set is on food security. We heard about food stocks, regional food stocks. A very important and known example is in Asia, the Asian +3 emergency rice reserve, for instance. In Western Africa, we have the Risogest approach, which is a coordinated network on national stocks in this region. And we have another very interesting example, and I'm happy that this is something new for today. Nobody talked about that, which is the African risk capacity, and I will show you that in a minute. Then there's another arena of regional guidelines or cooperation activities, more specifically on agriculture policy. Again, in Africa, the CAADP or Maputo or Malabo process, which is designed by the African Union, and the idea is to coordinate agriculture policies among different countries, not in such an harmonized way like in the EU. And then in the EU, we know, of course, the Common Agriculture Policy and other policy measures with a very strong regional focus, and I come to that in a second as well. So to give some best practices, or maybe not best, but good practices in certain regional cooperation. First of all, I would like to stress an African idea, which is this African risk capacity. And there the basic idea is to pool risks. That means via different countries affected differently by risk to have a kind of joint fund or insurance system. And this is applied to 23 African Union countries. And the idea is a bit shown here in this graph. Just to visualize it, you have here the calendar from January to December in different regions. So it's Sahel, first column, and then Gulf of Guinea in the second row, and several countries in these regions. And what is marked there is in gray, the typical seasons where there's a risk of drought. And in shaded, it's the typical seasons where are risks of floodings. And you see it's not equal across all the countries. So the countries are facing different risks. And that makes it ideal actually to join in a common fund. So they pay into a fund and they get payoffs once a crisis like a drought or a flooding appears. And there are several analyses showing, for instance, by IFPRI, that there are benefits compared to the usual ad hoc reactions of the international community, otherwise running for food aid or humanitarian assistance. So there's an increased speed of aid, there's a high self-commitment of these countries. And I just would like to stress two maybe major benefits of this approach as a kind of general criteria for a successful regional governance. And this is again analyzed by IFPRI. First, they say that they set up predictable conditions and binding institutional settings ex ante. They have a set of a code of conduct. All these countries follow national reporting, and these reports are approved by a trusted institution, which is set up at the African Union. There are clear criteria for premiums, so how large are the premiums, and for triggers of payments, and they are based on historical data and historical experience with natural disasters that had appeared. And a second set of successful criteria or success criteria is there is a comprehensive contingency, and even more, an implementing plan. So it's as well predefined what happens once the assistance payment is paid off. So, and this is maybe the most important issue besides getting financial support out of these funds. So there's an increasing preparedness approach, there's a monitoring approach, and the payment delivery should always follow, and this is reported then in these implementing plans, with the overall aim to reduce the basic risks. So not just to wait that the catastrophe will appear, but really to invest proactively. Coming now to the other regional example, which I'm working mostly about, that's the EU. And here I would like to stress again what we heard a lot. Here's a risk due to a huge set of very different policies finally addressing food security and food crisis. And what is shown here is in the first column, you see different types of policies, which are all European policies, but at a different degree of how large is the European competence on this policy, or is there an additional member state competence as well? And you all know the common agriculture policy, that's why I leave it out, but I would like to stress some issue about civil protection, the protection of critical infrastructure, the internal market as a kind of founding policy of the EU, and trade policy. Regarding civil protection, we have in the EU the so-called solidarity clause, and already mentioned by Arjen this morning, the crisis reaction mechanisms. There are actually two about it. And the basic idea is it's an all-hazard approach, so man-made and natural disasters, terrorist attacks and floodings or fires, things like that. And the idea is to have then a European-wide solidarity helping system. And there is as well quite newly, let's say, a European-owned reserve system applied in 2019. It's called RESC-EU, and there we have so far basically technical infrastructure on fire emergency, things like that, and that had been now extended as well by medical protective equipment. So there's a solidarity protective reserve system. Besides that, we have the policy of protection of critical infrastructures, and now it comes the problem of maybe some contradictory approaches. At the EU level, there are so far 3 sectors defined as being critical, which is energy, transport, and cyber, so IT. At the member state level, that differs. For instance, in Germany, we have much more sectors defined as being critical, 9, and food is one of it. And what does it mean? That means there are specific duties for operators. They need to impose certain emergency plans. On the other hand, they have, of course, as well, certain rights of being supported. Thinking about the Corona crisis, what are critical infrastructure? And they can then get their children to childcare. They can get protective equipment. They are priority number 1 of being vaccinated, things like that. So they have duties and rights. And they are differently defined so far at the member states and the EU level. So there some contradictions can appear. Another contradictory approach is if you look at internal market and trade policy. We all remember in the beginning of the corona, in the first phase, we had historically extraordinary internal border closures within the EU, which was one of the founding mobility areas not to have intra-European border closures. However, after a while, then it became clear that for so-called critical or essential goods, there should be green lanes. And that was relevant for agricultural goods and agricultural, so seasonal workers. So there was the idea to open the market. In trade policy, at least the existing WTO rules allow the opposite. So there are export restrictions possible for essentials if there is shortages feared. So this is where AMIS played a role, trying to warn about these kind of export restrictions. And in the corona crisis, food-related shortages hardly appeared. However, a lot of export restrictions took place on medical goods. So there's still a way to go and to think about how to solve that, because as we heard this morning, an open trade actually is a basic as well for stabilize value chains. To sum up, and to come back to the, let's say, starting theoretical criteria. On coherence, it's relevant what I tried to show with this set of very different European policies to overcome silo thinking and silo decisions, not to end up with contradictory solutions. How could one do that? To establish joint procedures, joint task forces. To, for instance, an existing example is the AMIS rapid response, to combine different actors. At the European level, we have the so-called better regulation package, and there we have as well these regulatory impact assessments, which are meant to follow the regulatory impact of one policy. But you could combine them. You could, for instance, check what you do within one policy, what for an effect would that have for another policy. There's another new approach in the EU, so-called the new strategic foresight, and there the EU proposes so-called sectoral dashboards on resilience, and they should cover different economic sectors, but as well societal and ecological sectors. That's how they define them, as sectors, in order to look at in what sectors we may have a problem. So this is just at the very, very first step now. On the criteria of information lacking, one should strengthen reporting. Maybe one could do that more in a political and proactive manner, like AMIS did so, especially in this corona pandemic. So they really had to follow the kind of information campaign together with international communities. On a regular basis, they warned about export restrictions, and they regularly informed that there is no food shortage situation, so there's no need really to restrict exports. So this is, I think, a very good example. And then on these theoretical criteria of fiscal equivalence, one major idea is to follow an integrative and clearly defined concept. So to have participatory approaches to increase, let's say, the own commitment, and as well to have a debate on balance of values to identify trade-offs. As well, if financing is applied with it, to define these mechanisms and clear trigger thresholds ex ante. Nothing is so complicated as to reform financial rulings after a crisis appears. So one should that do in the beginning best. And one example is, I would say, the African risk capacity. The EU contingency approach could support this, of course. Still, this still has to be clearly defined. And to end up, I would like to give as well a literature recommendation. So maybe one overarching key is the art of improvisation. We heard that a lot. So how to support flexibility in systems, in political structures. And there's a very nice, very small, fresh book from Luc van Middelaar. It's called The European Pandemonium. And this term pandemonium derives from an epos of John Milton called The Lost Paradise. And pandemonium is the name of the capital in this country of the lost paradise. And Middelaar, he derives the idea of how to support the skills of the EU as an improvisation system, and that there's need to further support that. And to end maybe a bit proactively, I would like to stress there can be as well a risk by the recent indicator hype, like in the EU new strategic foresight on all these kind of monitoring is important, but sometimes these indicatorization can be a kind of, yeah, how to say, symbolic policy only, and could limit energy to be increasingly aware of the next crisis is completely new, and one needs to be flexible and creative and not just ticking up lists of indicators. Hereby I stop for the moment. Thank you very much.